Welcome everybody to the latest installment of the Q Community Update. We've got a similar agenda to last time, but this first thing we're going to talk about today is a quick refresher on the roadmap for what it is we're working on Q-wise, as then following that going into the detail of each of the sections of what it is we're looking at. So onto that roadmap refresher. The overarching goal of what we're actually focused on at the moment is getting Q to V1. Principally having a stable language within that, with a focus on correctness and performance within that as well. Much like the Go project, though, that's not going to sort of preclude future changes, but we'll do so in a way that is backwards compatible and sensitive to the fact that we have reached V1. And so getting to V1, that's going to be supported by a featureful command queue, the Go API and related tooling, much of which you see today. There may be some new additions to that tooling along the way and new commands, for example, on command queue. But broadly speaking, the direction in which we're heading is sort of clear and based on what there is today. For example, QVet might be rethought between now and V1, but principally the concept of something like that will remain. And we also see the central registry from a dependency management perspective as a key enabler of the Q ecosystem. That's something else we're focused on. And also positioning Q as a true interlingua via a variety of encodings. So whether they be data-only encodings like JSON and YAML, or other languages or schemas like JSON schema or even Go. And Daniel will talk a bit more about one of those such encodings later on. Documentation is obviously, this is just a single word bullet point here, but documentation that covers a huge amount of stuff though. So there's quite a lot of detail behind that, but getting documentation right for new users as well as existing users is a key part of that focus to V1. And critically as well, one of our roles as we see it is supporting and enabling everybody who wants to use and build around Q, whether they are companies using Q in-house or companies building products that are based around Q, open source projects or any project, whatever it is, we see it as a role to help facilitate that Q ecosystem and its growth. Just the guiding principles for those people who may be newer to the project on how we actually go about this. Wherever we are making changes to the language, we're not at V1 yet, but wherever we are making changes to the language or tooling, we always aim to provide automated fixes so that Q you have written before can work, even though it might need to be changed in some way, shape, or form. So we use a lot of tooling around that, and that will continue to be our modus operandi going forward. So that really helped. That's a sort of another way of saying we have a strong focus on backwards compatibility wherever possible. As far as the languages are concerned, the tooling, the things that you can do with Q, that is really guided by real world situations and problems. And we continue for that to be a sort of a key focus of what it is we're doing. So if you think there's areas where we haven't got sufficient coverage from Q in real world situations, please let us know, because that's a key part of what it is we're actually trying to do, solve real world problems and situations. And to back that up, another key guiding principle is that we aim to test, especially in real world configurations. And Unity, something that we are using to help drive our development of the core evaluator, where we use real world configurations to know when we have broken things, is a key part of that promise as well. So please feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions about any of these specifics here, but this hopefully gives a bit of an overview as to where we're heading at like 60,000 feet, and so that some of the guiding principles and how we're looking to get there. So one thing I just wanted to call out before we get into the detail of each of the areas of the project is, where does eval v3 fit into this? And Marcel will talk a bit more about this a bit later on, as he has done on previous calls, but I just want to sort of get the framing right as far as eval v3 is concerned. So at the core of Q is the evaluator. We're working on a v3 of that evaluator, and Marcel will explain what that actually means in a tiny bit more detail later. And changing from v2 to v3 is a critical point for us. It's a critical inflection point to get right, because it enables a number of things. It enables all of the work that we're doing on the modules and central registry, for example, work on the LSP, we'll talk about that a bit later on, as well as work in the encoding space as well. So much of our effort since the last community call has been focused on this transition to V3 and getting that quotes right, ironing out bugs, getting things ready so we can make performance improvements. So we'll make reference to eval v3 in a number of our sort of the specific areas today. Just wanted to identify, though, that there has been a significant amount of behind-the-scenes effort on V3 since last time. And so you'll hear folks refer to that a number of times throughout. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Marcel. Oh, no, I won't. I'll be handing over to Daniel to talk about release updates. Sorry, Daniel.
So since the last time we did a community call update, we did release 0.12. Quite a lot of changes were included in that. I'm not going to go through all of them. There's the release notes if you want to read them. But the big ticket items are the embed and TopoSort experiments are now on by default. You can still turn them off, but you can sort of start relying on them as the new default. We also, like Paul mentioned, we've done a lot of work on the new evaluator. There's lots of JSON schema improvements that Roger continues to do. And we also have a couple of new commands. Roger will talk about QMod rename in a little bit, and I will talk about QExp Django types as well. And we've started working towards 0.13. The first alpha is not out yet, but very soon. And if, as Paul mentioned, if you're stuck on old versions, please reach out, especially to me. You can send me a DM, you can send me an email, whatever you want. And I'm particularly interested in people that are broken or rather stuck on older versions, either because of bugs or because of performance issues. And I'll leave it to Paul to decide whether we should handle questions now or later.
Feel free. That seems like an easy one to just go for.
Yes, the TLDR is that TopoSort is enabled in the Go API now by default. Embedding, there's currently an issue open, which I can link to in a second, because it's not enabled in the Go API by default. You have to add it as an interpreter yourself because of a technical limitation. I'll find the bug in a second.
Yep. Evaluator. Yeah, there we go. Yes. So yeah, just as a reminder, we're doing V3 to significantly improve the performance, the simplicity of the evaluator internally, and then maintainability. So it's both available as an API and as the command line as an experiment right now. And thank you again for everybody who contributed with bugs and trying it out and giving feedback, because it's been a lot. So to quantify that, so we've closed, if I count correctly, 59 issues on GitHub since the last update on this. So we have almost 100% of the core test suite now covered. There's basically one issue left, which is only barely a P1 issue, quite frankly. Then we have 10 remaining open issues, if I'm counting correctly. 2 of those are Unity related. There are some performance ones, and quite a few of those are related to the tooling. So this is where the changes in V3 affects how the API behaves, which then affects how some of the tooling behaves. So these are quite in the margin changes. So we do have some issues left that are not in Unity but that affect eval v3 directly, but there are quite a few, like not many. So some of the important fixes since last time we have, so the structural cycle algorithm is already a lot better in v3 than v2, much simpler. We've simplified it a bit more which worked around some bugs. There are still some cycles that could happen. It's a little bit, I can go in details, but not here. And then we have some more performance improvements. So and an update on the performance improvements. So there are still some performance issues left. So last time we showed that we have some configurations that went from 20 seconds to 1 second, or was it more than 20 seconds? But from minutes to 20 seconds to 1 second. Basically, we have some optimizations we're experimenting with where we see on our own configuration similar improvements. So we're looking at fine-grained structure sharing now. That's one of the things we're looking at. And then another thing that we're seeing is that if you look at closeness, it's by far the most expensive thing in Q, and it shouldn't be. So we're looking at either slightly changing the closeness semantics or doing some things differently there, where we where potentially it could be a lot of gain. So like more than 90% reduction in many cases, and most of the memory usage goes there. So seems to be a lot of possible improvement there. So in general, we also want to move towards V1, so like a stable version of Q. There's a lot of lessons we learned. So one of them is, with V3, we learned a lot from V2, but we also learned a lot from V3 about what some of the fundamental limitations are, looking if we can improve them. So closeness is one of them, which might require slight changes. So lessons learned from our users as well. So some people find defaults a bit complicated. So we're looking at maybe some slight changes there. And under the hood, the model, it's actually quite similar, but it might appear very different for the user. What's important is that we maintain composability, so that you have associative and commutative defaults, so that we will keep having, but it might be much more useful for the user if we make a few changes, which might also impact backwards compatibility. So closeness is one of them. So there's some possible readability improvements. And then, of course, there are some of the remaining proposals like query language and associative lists, which also require some backwards incompatible changes to support those. Again, if we have backwards incompatible changes, we plan to do a Q fix so that the transition is easy, and probably gauge it in some cases on the language version as well. And whether we do this or not, so whether we, like how much effort we have to put in a Q fix will be guided by Unity. So please put your projects in Unity if you can. So one example of that is we have a proposal for validator simplifications. So we've implemented this as a trial, and there is essentially no backwards, so no breakages in Unity whatsoever, right? So it's fairly in the margin. It's clearly a backwards incompatible change, but it's very minor. And it's so minor that in this case, we might not even do a Q fix for it, because we found no evidence of anybody being affected by it. So this is a change. So that's also needed to improve the equals semantics, which then in turn is needed for associative lists. So this is part of a larger plan. So our idea is to have, like we have some of these bigger plans, but the idea is to sort of step by step have now more of these smaller improvements and proposals. Yes, I'll hand it over to Matthew here.
Cool, thank you. Not entirely sure why the title's disappeared. Anyway, hello. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about qtrim. So qtrim is a command that's existed for quite some time. The purpose of trim is to identify and then remove redundant conjuncts from your Q source. So here we've got two definitions of greeting. One of them, the literal string, is obviously much more specific than the constraint string. So if we were to trim this, we would remove the first line. Where trim is often used is when simplifying more complicated data structures, particularly if you've got sort of some user data coming in, which repeats the same item many times. And here we can factor it out into a schema. And so now if you trimmed this, it would get rid of all of the age 5. So it would move it to this. So as I say, trim has existed for some time, but it's only been working with eval v2 before, and it had a large number of bugs in it. It would sometimes perform unsafe simplifications, particularly around lists. In general, what's desired is to completely minimize the source. It turns out that that's impossible to do on a normal computer. So consequently, that it's a best effort thing. There is a new implementation now available, which a new implementation has only been written for eval v3. And so if you're able to test with eval v3 turned on, either on master or from the 0.13 alpha releases, which are in progress, you'll have access to that. The new implementation has fixed all of the known bugs in Trim, but we have not made any changes to the version 2 of Trim. So it's only via the new Eval v3 that you'll get access to this new version of Trim and the bug fixes. The new version is more aggressive in some areas. So for example, the old version made an awful lot of decisions based on whether a particular conjunct was coming from a definition or a comprehension or not. The new version doesn't behave that same way. It treats all of these sort of different sources of conjuncts basically equally, and so it applies some different heuristics and different algorithms. So in some cases it's more aggressive, but also in other cases it's actually less aggressive, and this is probably as a result of its being safer. It's as far as we know, it doesn't remove things that are unsafe to remove. Before handing on, I do just want to mention TopoSort has been mentioned a couple of times in this. Since that was enabled by default in the previous release, 0.12, we have become aware that there are some performance issues with TopoSort. And so if that is something that you're suffering from and suddenly things are running a lot more slowly, you can disable the TopoSort with the environment variable. QExperiment, you can set TopoSort to 0, and just so that you know, we are aware of this and fixes for this will be coming soon. Thank you. Oh, there's the title. Brilliant.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, Marcel, anything else from your perspective whilst we're on the evaluator? Oh, sorry, the evaluator next steps. I see. I beg your pardon.
Yes.
The race on the next slide.
So our goal remains to flipping the default for v3. So as I said, most bugs are out, and right now v3 is still has some bugs, but it's significantly less bugs than v2, I would say. So the remaining things that we're focusing on now is removing some of the API differences, which are blocking some of our own tooling, and then we assume also some other people. And really getting that performance down, right? So that's the performance is the main blocker in Unity. There's some issues, but they're generally not very big ones in Unity. So performance is really the big one to reduce further. And so we will be using Unity as the main criteria, you know, like the main litmus test for when we're ready to move. So please keep that in mind, and you know, if you can have your projects added. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. The one thing that we haven't talked about is that we're writing an FAQ that explains how to consider the upgrade from V2 to V3. An FAQ that will sort of explain how you actually go about it, what version you should use, common things that you might run into when upgrading to V3. Please give us feedback on that. We'll send out links. Apologies, we almost had it ready to include in the slides here. We will include it in the slides when we publish them, but we'll also send out notifications in Slack and Discord as well, possibly even starting a GitHub discussion to sort of gather conversation around that in case folks have questions or suggestions. Just briefly on the performance side of things, Marcel's talked about performance issues. Whilst a small number of users see big performance problems in very large queue configurations, it is fair to say that a large number of users who have small to medium-sized queue configurations do not see performance problems. And so it's important, I think, to just set that whole context of, okay, where are these performance problems? We are aware of the performance problems, and that's a key focus. But for a number of users, performance is, quote, not an issue. Whereas for a small number of people with large configurations, it is an issue. It's just important to get those numbers sort of clear in our heads when we're talking about performance problems, so not to skew things. Apologies, I think a few of our slides also, as this one does here, talk about v3, where it's unclear that we're talking about eval v3. We'll tidy that up. So we're explicitly talking about eval v3 so as not to confuse with qv3 or anything like that. We'll make that a bit more consistent as well. Thanks, Marcel, and thanks, Matthew. And I think we can move on to Q with other languages. This is just a brief placeholder. We have done some work in this space. We're not actively working on this at the moment, where libq, exposed as a C API, is used as the basis then for Q libraries in Java and Python, where the Q package, beg your pardon, the Go library is wrapped effectively with the C API. We're not actively working on it, but if this is an area of interest, some folks, for example, have talked about creating a Zig interface at some point. Please shout, get in touch, ping us on Slack or Discord to just share that if you're considering doing work in this space as well. All of these things are linked from here if folks do want to have a kick around and play with this, but it's not something we're actively working on at the moment, largely because we are very, very focused, as you've seen, on eval v3 at the moment. Encodings, Daniel.
Yes. So even though I've been spending a significant amount of my time on Unity and the evaluator and things like that, there's also been some news on the encoding side. So one example that I like referring to and that keeps coming up on Slack and Discord is somebody having a Go program that consumes a config, and they want to write a Q schema for it, for things like, for example, saying that a port is optional and defaults to 8080, but then a database URL for a service is required, is a required field. And then what you want to do usually is you want to validate a user's config in YAML or JSON or TOML or whatever else with the Q schema and those validations and apply the defaults and so on. And then you want to decode that into a Go value that you can use directly, for example, with the struct, like you can see there. And that works fine. What people have been doing so far is to not have to maintain the Go type and the Q schema next to each other at the same time and risk them getting out of sync. You could use qgetGo for this reason, but it's kind of not great because if you try to write your source of truth in Go, the Q that you get out of that is fairly basic. It's lost things like the required fields and the default and so on. And the reason for that is because Go types are not as expressive as Q, right? You can sort of describe optional fields with omit empty, but you cannot describe required fields. You cannot do default. You cannot do pattern constraints either. If you want to write extra validation in Q, you can do it as a second file, but that's kind of awkward. And it's just nicer to have a single source of truth for all of your schemas and structures and so on in Q. So the new command that Q already has in 0.12 and stable is called qexp gen-go types, and the exp prefix there is just a way to signal this is experimental. It likely will survive in some way, but the interface might be slightly different once we get more testing and input. But basically, it's the other way around to qgetGo. You give it a package or a set of Q files, and it will infer Go types from the Q definitions. From the Q schemas. And you can see that it's lossy. So for example, it's lost the default because, again, Go has no way to define defaults. But it's usually good enough where you can do the decoding and validation with Q and then obtain a Go value from that, and it should work. But it's nice in that just like with the previous method with qgetGo, you don't have to repeat yourself with the Go types. Another bit of news that isn't landed, nothing has landed in Q master yet, but there is a proposal discussion on GitHub for an XML encoding in Q called Koala. It borrows ideas from a convention to translate XML documents to JSON called Badgerfish. And that is a bit of a mouthful, but the TLDR is that XML is very different to JSON, right? Because XML has namespaces. And XML also doesn't really have the concept of objects and arrays. It just has the concept of XML elements and sub-elements and text free-floating in between. So if you want to translate to JSON, or for that matter, Q, you need some sort of convention to map that in a human-friendly way. So Badgerfish is one such convention. And what the proposal by Matthew has done is sort of make that a bit more Q-friendly. And to not name it Badgerfish, to not confuse people, they've decided to name it Koala. And to be extremely clear, this would be one way to decode XML into Q. There's no intention to bless this as the only way to decode XML into Q, because as I described, there could be multiple conventions or multiple approaches to doing that. No single method is going to be perfect. And to give an idea of how this might look if or when this gets implemented in Q as an experimental encoding, you could imagine a qvet command where you validate some XML against a schema, and you have to say, I want to interpret this XML as koala, because this is like an opt-in choice of how exactly, which convention or interpretation of XML do you want to use, because it might be that we never end up having one that fits everybody's use case.
I was only going to add one comment there. Thank you. Just to emphasize the experimental nature of the GenGo types and the koala encoding, the experiments have continued to work really, really well. When sort of accompanied by sort of like a mini design doc or proposal, it's worked very nicely. And the XML encoding that's proposed by Matthew Sledescu and his team is driven really by the real world situation that they're dealing with. So again, this is another example of where Q is, what we're trying to do is make sure Q is well suited to real world situations that people are trying to solve for and problems that they're running into. So again, if you have experience in the XML space, or think to yourself, oh, hang on a second, we also could validate our XML files in the same way, please take a look at that, and also just add some comments as to whether you see it heading, if the proposal as it stands would be fine for you, or if Daniel suggested, actually, you know what, you need a slightly different way when handling your XML files. All of this stuff very much driven on a case-by-case basis, but we're trying to not solve for specific cases, solve for general cases, but do so based on real-world situations. Thank you very much. Roger, I think you're talking about modules in the central registry.
Yeah, so up to bring you up to date on what sort of things we've done. Ironically, given what the command Daniel mentioned earlier, saying we're going to talk about that later, I totally forgot about that command. And the only commands that I'm mentioning here are the other ones. So I'll actually talk about qmod rename first before I talk about those other ones, because it's useful. So it's common when you start off by creating a Q module that you choose an arbitrary name for it, because you don't know where you're going to put it. And when you're going to actually upload it, like I'm going to put it under this GitHub repository, I'm going to put it somewhere else. And you've perhaps already got lots of input paths that are importing things within that module. And it's a bit of a pain to go through and actually update those import paths. So qmod rename essentially says I can rename the current main module to something else, and it will intelligently update all the import paths that are within the current module to now refer to the new name, and it will update the module.q file as well. So that's kind of useful. And there are a couple of other ones that I'll mention, other little commands that are potentially useful to people. The first one, there's qmod mirror and qrefactor imports. So the first one allows you to copy modules and their dependencies from one registry to another in a Q-aware way. So for example, you can have your registry configuration set up so that you've got encoded tags, so that the module paths are encoded in different ways. This tool will be aware of that, and it will copy, by default, all the module and all its dependencies. So for example, if I, like as an example here, if I've got a registry of my own set up somewhere, it might be a Docker registry, it might even be an in-memory registry run qmod registry. It works with this. You say qmod mirror, and you give it -2, and you have that's just like the Q registry environment variable. You say copy it to this place, and you say what modules to copy, and that will copy. In this case, that command works. Well, assuming my registry.example was a registry, and that would copy the Kubernetes module from its new experimental place to your local registry. And then you can just point your Q registry at that local registry and import modules as usual. So that should be useful for people that are deploying to different regions, for example, and want to amortize time spent downloading modules from the central registry, for example. There are a bunch of use cases. And another command is refactor imports. So this was written partially with, a strong use case for it was migrating from when you've got qget-go imports to imports from the central registry. When the package namespaces are aligned, which they are in the K8s.io case, you can say refactor imports, and you give it an old prefix, import path prefix, and a new one, and it will find all occurrences of the old one and replace them with the new one. In a import path aware fashion. So that's pretty useful. You can just run that command for that particular example. Command works to update your Kubernetes imports to the new path, which of course is experimental. But when it comes to change from the experiment to the final place, you'll be able to do the same thing to migrate from qtump x3 to whatever name we choose in the end, and that should be reasonably hassle-free. Once you've done the refactor, then you can run qmod tidy to update the dependencies. You can also use that to rewrite. It's a fairly general command. You can use that to rewrite package imports as well. And there's So I'm sure someone will link to the documentation. And when we talk about the central registry, I'll just remind for those who haven't had the blurb before, the central registry is our place that we like to put for people to put well-known schemas for well-known services, or any other services, in fact. Basically, schemas in a central place where anyone can retrieve them from. And it's in a domain name based namespace, so the names are domain name based, so that gives us clear ownership. But the actual source of truth is the registry. And for now, we only support GitHub.com rooted modules, and we're using GitHub authorization for everything at the moment. That won't be the true forever, but for now, it's a good way of getting us bootstrapped. We're using semantic versions, so you're expected to keep things compatible according to semantic versioning, and you can publish those modules from anywhere you like, really. You can publish them if you're writing them in Cube, though perhaps you're translating from something else and you want to publish them from some upstream source of truth, and that's what we're doing with our curated modules. And yep, just try it out. The name might change in the future, but for now, registry.q.works, give it a go. And as part of that, to make it more useful, we're curating some schemas. So we're taking some chosen schemas from the outside world. Currently, these are all JSON schema derived because that's a good source of schemas from outside. Translating them, testing them, and uploading them to the Q modules to the central registry. And this has been a big part of what I've been doing certainly over the last few months, making that predictable, making that workflow predictable, and fixing encoding JSON schema, for example, to make these things a better quality representation of the underlying schema. And I've listed a few of the example schemas we've got in there. And there will be more. So here's an example of using it. You can import this. This will work. You can see that X3 there. Last month we had a similar update. We've moved through a few iterations. We're keeping on moving through experimental iterations. The old ones still remain around, but the latest one is X3. And there we're importing the GitHub Actions package, and then you can just use GitHub Actions.workflow as a schema for your workflow file, which is kind of useful. As far as what we're going to do next, there's a lot of documentation to be done, so to make it clear how to use these curated schemas and what curated schemas are available. We plan on publishing a bunch of Kubernetes CRDs as curated modules. Exactly which ones to choose we still need to look into, but the general principle is that we want to be able to translate any CRD, just as we can translate any JSON schema. We're going to move to a non-experimental path in the central registry to be decided. And lots of improved rendering of docs. The docs rendering at the moment is very rudimentary. That should become way better. Search and discovery, absolutely crucial. That's also on its way. We want to make it so that if you're running, if you want to work with the central registry in a GitHub action to push modules, that you get automatic authentication of that, so you don't have to do anything with tokens in order to make that work. We want vanity domain support, so that so-called vanity domains other than github.com, essentially. So if you control a domain, you'll be able to publish a module under that domain. You'll be able to prove, you'll have to prove that you have ownership of that domain in a specific way, and then that will allow you to upload modules for that domain to the central registry. And as far as curated modules, if you're interested in seeing a particular schema inside the curated modules, please contact us. Things to look out for. Yes, please try out curated modules. If they don't work for you, then we want to know. If they do, we'd like to know as well. And you can give us feedback on the modules channels or in direct or directly. And there are some documentation links. The first one, there is a link there. The FAQ should be a link and will be real soon now. And the amount of documentation, Jonathan Matthews has been working tirelessly on making really good documentation for some of this stuff. And that will continue to grow. And we'll probably have some office hours calls to demonstrate and explore curated modules. So watch this space.
Yeah, we had hoped for this slide to be rather a bit more full of links with a scheduled office hours as well. So we're nearly there. Basically, it'll be at the beginning of next week. Expect a sort of flurry of notifications via Discord, Slack, and GitHub discussions where we share more concretely links to exactly the documentation that Rog talked about. That documentation will probably hang everything off the FAQ just as a means of helping folks get started. It'll hopefully lead you by the hand if you have like a greenfield situation where you want to try, for example, Q with Kubernetes. It'll show you how to get started. Or as Rog suggested, if you want to go from an existing Q-get-go based Kubernetes configuration, we'll show you how to do that as well. Otherwise, we are definitely looking for feedback. The bulk of Rog's time since the last community call has been spent on preparing the ground for these curated modules. So the central registry itself, the UI and the UX, has not changed much since last time. We've necessarily been focusing on the internals, for want of a better phrase, as well as the eval v3 piece. So those UI UX improvements that you would expect from such a registry will follow next. We've been getting all the basics right. Thanks, Rog.
I will just call out David's question just because. So David said, why do we go JSON schema rather than converting from Q-get-go? And I think that's a really good question. And Daniel says the right answer, but briefly. So I'd say more specifically, a really good example of this is, for example, the JSON schema that we're importing for Kubernetes takes into account all the Kubernetes specific tags, which are not supported by Q-get-go. We could have updated Q-get-go to support some of those tags, but actually the Kubernetes folks have already done that and are already exporting OpenAPI, which has these particular kinds of constraints in there. And in general, JSON schema is a more expressive way of describing the schemas than Go is. And lots of people alrety produce OpenAPI JSON schema documents, which is why we went in that direction. This is not necessary to preclude having Q-got-go sources for the curated modules in cases where there is no other alternative. But certainly most bang for the buck initially was going with JSON schema.
And just to say out loud is that, coming back to the whole encodings point, is that fundamentally, if folks actually in some situations want to shift to Q as a source of truth and emit OpenAPI, JSON schema, or as Daniel demonstrated, emit Go, then that's fully something that is on the roadmap for fully supporting that in lots of different languages and encodings.
Yeah, but for the time being, the curated modules are a relatively lightweight translation layer between upstream schemas and what's published. So, for example, this came up very recently. If you want a new definition to be exported in a curated schema, we probably can do it in the curation layer, but it's much better to interact with upstream to get them to produce a particular definition, a new definition there. So this came up very recently in the GitHub Actions space.
So I was going to say, we'll look to cover points like that and more in the FAQ, so that folks who want to get started in this can just dive into the FAQ and then get in touch if there's any questions.
Yeah.
Oh, and here is that. Here is that. Getting started with Kubernetes and Q documentation that's now published. This is what's rendered if you click on the link on the previous slide. So as I said, early next week, we'll send out a more comprehensive getting started guide for folks who want to dig into the curated modules in their experimental location. If David, I'll come, if it's okay, we'll return to your question later on. Just, I don't want to time out on getting through other things, but I promise we'll come back to your question at the end with your permission. So briefly to talk about, I can talk about the QLSP side of things. The key update since the last call is that the work on the LSP is dependent on eval v3. Hence, we have shifted to focus on, as I've mentioned now on a couple of occasions, getting eval v3 flipped to be the default. That flipping of the default, as Marcel updated, is making good progress. It's likely to flip the default in 13. I say likely, save for something significant that causes us to change from that path. Every ounce of our effort at the moment is geared towards flipping the default as quickly as possible. The reason being, as I said at the top of the presentation today, that there are a number of key things hanging off eval v3, and the LSP is one of them. So QLSP will therefore likely land in its initial form in 13 as well. The nice thing being is that when we have flipped the default for eval v3, all of those resources that we are currently expending on working on eval v3 and flipping the default can then start to be shifted to other things, and whether that be the curated modules, the central registry, or indeed things like LSP as well. So just to confirm, though, this is still very much on the roadmap, but it is blocked effectively at the moment by the work on eval v3. When it does land, though, the initial version will contain the formatting, go to definition, hover docs, and error diagnostics, tested against or within whatever you want to call it, VS Code and NeoVim. Oh, I've lost the slide. Oh, excuse me. Pardon me. I'm clicking all over the shop here. This just summarizes the next steps from last time because they haven't significantly changed. We will also be publishing the extension to OpenVSX, as well as ensuring that we have good nightly versions for folks who want to stay on the bleeding edge of changes as well, and making sure we have good documentation. So apologies, the update here is light. Hopefully it's well explained why it is light in this situation. The effort has necessarily been on the eval v3 side of things. It is still absolutely a focus for us, though, to have the LSP, as well as things like the curated module, central registry, etc. It's not like eval v3 is sucking all the energy out of anything. It's just a sequencing thing in this situation. Community updates. Dominic.
Yes, things on the same time. Moving to community updates. So first, big thank you to everyone participating on Discord and Slack. There's a lot of activity there right now, a lot of input, a lot of questions, a lot of people asking questions, but also answering questions, and that is very much appreciated. It helps us a lot. We see what's going on in the community, where we can focus on, and yeah, just great contribution. So the next point is we've talked a lot about the central registry and modules right now. And if you want to be ready by day one, if you want to see your modules live, but also want demo, want to see it, what it would mean for you, you can please reach out to us directly. I added all my contact information to the right of the slide, so just let us know. The same is true. We are currently looking into Q case studies. If you have a use case of Q that you would like to share, and if we can help you there, if we can collaborate on this to publish a case study together, please reach out. We're happy to help there. And if you want to see your logo on the qlang.org website, also let us know. We already have some companies there, and it's always greatly appreciated. So next slide. If you need help also with Q and your unique use case, we get addressed and contacted a lot by people who are evaluating Q or currently implementing Q with their companies, and we always try to help. It's great that they're doing it, and if you want our input there, just let us know, contact us. Again, all my contacts are here. Be it evaluating Q for your use case or having specific challenges or wanting to achieve a specific goal, just let us know. And my last slide here is Daniel and Paul will be at KubeCon London. I think we got asked on GitHub whether we're there. So yes, Daniel and Paul will be there. You can DM directly to them on Slack or Discord to set up a meet. And we're also planning to do like a Q open house, whether it's a meet and greet or just a lunch meeting. The details to be decided. We created a Google form that I will share after this call so people can, can express their interest. So the goal here is to bring a group of people that are interested in Q of the community together and just share ideas, experiences. So details to be decided. I will share the Google form later, and we're setting up something there.
Yeah, I think that's it. The only thing I was going to add, just going back to the central registry point here, is that there are a number of other projects. So Roger talked about the curated modules that we are publishing to the central registry. There are a number of other projects that are also publishing their modules to the central registry as well. So there's no upstream. They are the authors of these modules, and they're native Q modules in this case. So that's highly encouraged. And if other projects want support and help in actually doing that, we're really happy to. What we're going to do as we make changes to the central registry over the course of the next month is better surface things like search and discovery, so that those other modules, you can also discover them via the central registry as well. Much like in other package managers like pkg.go.dev, where you've got the discovery aspect, that's a key bit. So it's not just the curated modules that we're publishing, it's absolutely intended that they form part of a much wider ecosystem, and that we sort of our work on the central registry exists to support that wider work. So yeah, if you are coming back to the KubeCon point, be delighted to see folks. We are also really happy to do demo sessions on things like curated modules, working with QX, Django types, whatever it might be. If you want to sit down and spend time with us, really happy to open the laptop and get stuck into anything you'd like to take a look at. Other than that, we have some questions, and David, I will now return to your question where you've been patiently waiting. Rog, did you want to take a look at that one?
Yeah, sure. So, will module, the question being, will all modules document if their source JSON schema is maintained by the upstream maintainers? And knowing that makes a big difference, which is indeed the case. So yes, we plan on, so metadata about modules in general is a big part of our plan. And so there's a bunch of possibilities for metadata, but we want to have a general scheme for people to be able to add metadata to their modules, and not just metadata that is existing when the module is published, but also potentially metadata that occurs or arises after the module has been published, because you might, for example, one possibility is that for the Kubernetes module, the versions don't follow the Kubernetes upstream versions. But actually, we want, for example, the metadata to be able to say this particular module was derived from this Kubernetes upstream version. And some other tool might come along later where we're like, oh, this also uses that schema, and then we want to add metadata for that. And so for particularly with the curated modules, yes, we'd like to document, not just document, but actually have as properly well-formed, machine-readable metadata what the sources are, and what the whole situation is regarding those modules, so that you can we can build tooling around that to say, for example, tooling that might say, where has this come from upstream? What's the ownership situation of this? There's a bunch of possibilities for metadata, and we'll start by defining a format, the basic structure of that metadata, and we will stop slowly to fill in little bits of that. Starting, I think the curated modules are exactly where we'll start with that.
David, did you have a specific point you wanted to come in on that? Or we can't hear you, David, for some reason. Yes,
Yep.
Now we can.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. The point there is that for some projects like Kubernetes, I'm always behind in my version, so it's okay. But some projects like Argo Workflows, we're always at the at the latest minor, and so if they're not maintained by the upstream maintainers, then the schemas won't be up to date with the latest version. And then we would run the risk of not being able to upgrade to that very latest version. And so knowing that the schema is updated at the time of the tag for the upstream project lets you know that you can rely on that schema if you're bleeding edge.
Yeah, I mean, so currently we do not do automatic updates, and I'm not sure that certainly in the near future, we're probably not going to do automatically update if tip updates, because avoiding that means that we can actually run our tests and choose a version with respect to the upstream version, and that sort of thing. Because so we certainly plan to be not far behind, and I think we'll probably have things to tell us when upstreams have changed, so that we know when to update them. But I'm not sure we're actually going to be, they've published and we immediately 5 minutes later it's going to be published on the central registry. Certainly for now, that might change in the future, particularly if the use case, if that's an important use case, then we can certainly build out some tooling to support that use case.
Yeah,
David,
maybe launch it as an alpha or
Thanks.
something. Sorry.
Sorry, Marcel, I didn't mean to cut across you. Apologies.
Yeah, so like maybe even if it's very important, launch it as an alpha or something like that immediately.
Yeah, I think the key thing is there's a number of things, and David, your question about sort of upstream information it sort of hints at so many, whether it be the upstream version, how well it's maintained, all sorts of all manner of sins is covered by that, really. And Roger's point, just to build on it, where he said we want to add structured information, is absolutely key. Is that we see something like the central registry being a means to search according to that metadata in some way, shape or form, or to order it according to that metadata. So maybe, for example, you are only interested in packages in your search via the central registry that are well maintained, for some definition of well maintained upstream, right? And so if we have metadata that is attached to modules that are published to the central registry, this is a bit of a toy example that says well maintained, then that's the only thing you will see in your search results. And so even though if you go beyond that sort of toy example, you can sort of start to see how we can make that discovery experience much richer and much more relevant and much more reliable as a result of adding this metadata. So I definitely encourage you, David, once we send this out at the beginning of next week, to help kick the tires on it and to work out what the gaps are. Because if, as you identify, like there, for Argo, again, just to riff on that example for a second, it's problematic because the versions change in the following way. We're really keen to hear about that. We spend a decent amount of time trying to explore some of the constraints that exist in the versioning space, but really happy if there are gaps that you can help identify where we need to plug those gaps. Really happy to do that, especially sort of in this early experimental stage.
Thanks so much.
Anybody else have any questions? Hopefully, thanks to those who asked questions via the discussion on GitHub. Hopefully we've covered those off. If not, happy to answer in more detail now or follow up afterwards. Otherwise, we can just call it a wrap there for today on the basis that we're just about within time. Look forward to sharing more updates on whether it be eval v3 encodings, curated modules, central registry, LSP, the flipped eval flipping the default for eval v3. We'll keep everybody updated in the interim, and especially, as Roger said, on the curated module side of things, for those really wishing to kick the tires early on that, we'll send out stuff via Discord, Slack, and GitHub discussions before the next community update. Thanks, everybody.